For as the light of the morning cometh out of the east, and shineth even unto the west, and covereth the whole earth, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. Therefore sanctify yourselves, that your minds become single to God, and the days will come that you shall see him. For he will unveil his face unto you, and it shall be in his own time, and in his own way, and according to his own will. This is unveiling Jesus Christ.
Hi, welcome to another podcast on Unveiling Jesus Christ. I'm John Cassanet. Today we're going to be talking about the opening of the seven seals. We're going to start out with an overview of the opening of the seven seals by the Savior. And if you want to get the nutshell version or condensed version of this podcast in writing, you can check out section 51 in my book. Now, by way of background, we learned in Revelation chapter 5 that there was this book that had seven seals that only Christ could open, and he received it from the right hand of the Father sitting on the throne. If you go back and listen to my podcast from May 26th of 2024 that covers Revelation 5 verses 5 through 7, you get a lot more details of what I'm talking about, but you kind of need to understand that as we begin our overview of what's going to be happening as each of the seven seals is then opened by Jesus Christ, who is the Lion of the tribe of Judah and the Lamb of God. And what we learn, of course, is that the opening of the seven seals reveals or carry out the plan of redemption throughout the history of the earth in its temporal condition. And so that's essentially what we're going to be talking a little bit about. Now, in the future, as we talk about the individual seals, if you have questions or need context kind of connecting the seven seals and how they flow, you can always kind of come back to this section just as kind of a foundation to build on. So that's what our purpose is today. The opening of the seven seals begins in Revelation chapter 6, and as each seal is opened, this symbolizes the ongoing work of Christ's redemption here upon the earth. And so the opening isn't just a declaration of what God plans to do or has done during the particular time frame of a particular seal. Each seal exhibits a purpose that has then been accomplished. And so whenever a seal is opened, essentially what you're seeing is the purposes of God being executed in specific time frames. Now, some of them are historical, 4 to be precise, and some of them are going to be prophetic, meaning in the future, as of John's vision in Revelation, in 96 AD, when he had his revelation on the island of Patmos. And so what we're doing in this section is essentially we're kind of stepping back from the forest before we start to focus on the individual trees within that forest. And we're going to be focusing in this podcast primarily on the first six of seven seals. And the reason for that is by the time you get to the seventh seal, it is so big that there's really no easy way to kind of summarize it or condense it down. So I'll give you kind of an intro to it, but we're going to save the meat of that seventh seal for the point in time when we get there in Revelation chapter 8. Now, needless to say, there are a variety of theories about the meaning and timing of the seven seals. I want to just kind of give you two examples of what some of the people are saying, keeping in mind that I've already told you in some of the prior podcasts that the seven seals essentially represent the seven periods of the Earth's temporal history that begins back in the time of Adam, and then you have one seal for each of the 1,000-year periods of the Earth's temporal existence. So you've already got that. So kind of contrast what I'm about to tell you is in terms of the views of other people in comparison to what we are scripturally told is the actual meaning of the seven seals. So I begin with a quote from Matthew Poole, who lived from 1624 through 1679. So he was one of the people that lived in the time of the Reformation, and he's probably best known for a synopsis he did on the Bible called the Synopsis Criticorum Biblicorum. And in that, he kind of goes through and he summarizes the views of over 100 biblical critics. And he also did his English annotation of the Holy Bible. And that's what this quote is taken from, which says, which is his description of the seven seals. And he says, quote, "I agree with those who think that God, by the first 6 seals, intends the whole space from the time when the things written in this book began to be fulfilled unto the time when paganism was rooted out of the Roman Empire, which some make the year 310, some 325. So as what we have revealed in and under the first 6 seals happens within the short space of the 300 or 325 years after Christ. I am apt to think after 98 or 100 of them were elapsed." Close quote. So you can see he's talking about the first 6 seals encompassing this 300 years after the time of Christ's crucifixion, which is a little bit inconsistent with the idea that it's covering 7,000-year periods beginning back in the year 4000 BC at the fall of Adam. Another biblical scholar is moving forward in time to someone who's still alive. His name is Peter Pett. He's a retired Baptist minister and college lecturer. He was trained in theology at the London Bible College and the London School of Theology, and he wrote one of the largest biblical commentaries currently available. And this is what he says about the seals. He says, quote, "The seals are opened one by one, but they are opened immediately. The events which they describe are parallel, not consecutive. The false messiahs, the great wars, the famines and the pestilences, and the massive slaughter, seals 1 through 4, together with the persecution of God's people in seal 5, all occur contemporaneously. They present the march of world history. This has been especially the history of the world of the Near and Middle East. The 6th seal is also contemporaneous. Thus, the 7th seal, which results in the blowing of the 7 trumpets, is also contemporaneous. And so I'm not exactly sure what the time period is that he's decided that all these things are contemporaneously happening, but to him, rather than being a sequential series of openings representing these 1,000-year periods, basically it all happens at the same time, and they're all getting opened at exactly the same time. So this gives you just a sense of the divergent views that exist as to the meaning of these 7 seals. Now, we are fortunate in having the scriptural definition given to us in Doctrine and Covenants, section 77, verses 6 through 7, where Joseph Smith had the frequently asked questions section, as I've mentioned before. And in this section, he asks the question, quote, "What are we to understand by the book which John saw, which was sealed on the back with 7 seals? Answer, we are to understand that it contains the revealed will, mysteries, and the works of God, the hidden things of his economy concerning this earth during the 7,000 years of its continuance, or its temporal existence. What are we to understand by the 7 seals with which it was sealed?" is the next question. Answer, we are to understand that the first seal contains the things of the first 1,000 years, and the second also of the second 1,000 years, and so on until the 7th. Close quote. Now, one thing I emphasize with regard to this overview and our discussion about what these 7 seals actually mean, you have to recognize that if this is not understood, there's no way you can understand the book of Revelation. If we can't get this very fundamental structure of the book of Revelation understood and clearly in our minds, then I'm kind of fumbling over my words. I can't even begin to express what you can't understand if you don't understand these basic concepts about what each of these seals mean, because they are going throughout the book of Revelation and help us to understand the structure. And so essentially you have the first seal being opened back at the time of the fall of Adam. You have the 6th seal open, which is the time period in which we're now approaching. If you don't understand what these seals are, you have no clue what period of history we're even talking about. But we'll get into this a little bit more as to the meaning of each seal in this overview. But Elder Orson F. Whitney said this, quote, "According to our prophet's teachings, God gave to this planet, Mother Earth, 7,000 years as the period of its temporal existence, and 4,000 years, or 4 of those great days, had passed before Christ was crucified, while nearly 2,000 years, or 2 more days, have gone by since. Consequently, we stand at the present moment in the Saturday evening of time, near the close of the 6th day, at the week's end of human history. Morning will break upon the millennium, the 1,000 years of peace, the Sabbath of the world." Close quote. Now, his discussion of the concept of the one day and a second day, goes back to the time of the creation, where one day with God represented 1,000 years as the reckoning of man is concerned. And so he kind of refers to these 1,000-year periods as though there's still this one day, which according to God's reckoning would be 1,000 years. And so that's what he's essentially describing. But the point is that these 7,000 years from the fall of Adam are encompassed within these 7 seals, including to the end of the earth. That would include also its celestialization, which is described in Revelation chapter 21 in the book of Revelation. Okay, so let's kind of start to dissect these just a little bit more as we continue our overview, talking about the first 4 seals. And as was mentioned, these cover the first 4,000 years, and these dates are kind of approximate. And I mentioned before that the seals don't fall exactly on the 1,000-year break between each of the seals. So it's a kind of a little bit of a plus or minus thing. But essentially, these first 4 seals are going to go from the fall of Adam until the birth of Jesus Christ. And this correlates pretty closely with the chronology that was developed by Archbishop Usher, who lived from the years 1581 through 1658. And he created this dating system for the Old and New Testament that has been widely used in Jewish and Christian circles. And in order to come up with these dates, he basically used data that he could get from the Bible itself, and he also used extra biblical sources, including Jewish and Christian traditions, to come up with this concept of dating the biblical chronology, going back, of course, to the time of Adam. Now, he kind of began with the assumption that Jesus was born in the year 4 BC, which is an assumption that's questionable. I think the reality of it is, if you look at Book of Mormon dating, which Bishop Usher obviously didn't use back in the time he was alive, he didn't have the Book of Mormon to kind of use to check his dates. But if you use Book of Mormon dating, and we have the destruction of many Nephite cities at the time of Christ's crucifixion, it kind of gives us some specific dates. And also, from the time the Book of Mormon began, and it dates from 600 years before the coming of Christ until his coming was the date on which Lehi and his family left Jerusalem. So the 4 BC is a little bit dubious, but based on using that date, Bishop Usher concluded that the creation occurred 4,004 years before the coming of Christ. Now, he's also kind of a little bit off here, because he uses that as the date of creation, but and kind of assumes that it took 7 days for the creation to occur. We take that date to be from the fall of Adam, without specifying how many years were actually entailed in the creation itself. Now, I'm a person of the belief that because the Lord was doing the creation according to his reckoning of time, one day with him represented 1,000 years on earth, which gives rise to my own personal belief that the creation took a period of about 7,000 years. And someday I'll get into how I conclude that, besides just the niceties of one day with the Lord is as 1,000 with men, as described by the Apostle Peter in his writings. But at any rate, if we take the 4004 BC date from the time of the fall of Adam, that then puts us at about 2349 BC for the flood. It puts us at about 2200 BC for the Tower of Babel. That is pretty consistent with when the Jaredites, the brother of Jared and his families, left the Tower of Babel, or at the time of the confusion of tongues, and crossed over the ocean to occupy the promised land on the Western Hemisphere. So those dates do correlate pretty closely. We have to keep in mind that these dates always have to be used with some degree of a caution. Many people and scholars today have their own system of dating and don't accept the dates. However, you have to kind of keep in mind that his dating to the fall of Adam back to approximately the year 4000 is scripturally confirmed in Doctrine and Covenants section 77. So, I wouldn't just take Bishop Utscher's chronology and toss it out the window because scholars happen to disagree, because we have at least some scriptural confirmation that that's a pretty accurate chronology. And Joseph Fielding Smith had this to say when he said, quote, "We read that Christ came in the meridian of time, or about 4,000 years after the fall of Adam," close quote. So he was also of a like opinion that the 4,000 years is a pretty accurate representation of the timing. Bruce R. McConkie had this to say, quote, "We know categorically that from the fall of Adam to the second coming of Christ is a period of some 6,000 years, and that the millennial era will then continue for another 1,000 years. Such is the chronology recited in the Bible, which has been confirmed by revelation to the prophet Joseph Smith. This in no way names the day nor the hour of our Lord's return, and it does not put a stamp of divine approval upon our calendars as they now exist. It simply lets us know that the biblical account of the chronology relative to Adam and his posterity is either correct or substantially so. The number of years there recited is either accurate or nearly so that it does not make any real difference for our purposes." Close quote. Okay, now the last thing I'll simply say in terms of how much we can trust this particular dating is, if you look at the chronological chart of biblical dates in the Bible dictionary of the LDS version of the scriptures, it identifies the fall of Adam at 4000 BC. So somebody, when they were creating the LDS Bible Dictionary, put enough stock in it that it got included in our own Bible dictionary. And frankly, Bruce R. McConkie had a pretty big hand in that. And so I'm sure he had his eyes looking at it, and his understanding was personally pretty closely connected to the decision to include that particular chronology. Okay, looking now at some of the symbolism of these first four historical seals. And we call them historical seals because, of course, John was having his revelation on the island of Patmos in about 96 AD, and the first four seals would go up to the time of Christ's birth, roughly 1 AD, I'm going to call it. And so when we're talking about historical seals, they're historical from the standpoint that John is seeing them historically because his vision is occurring in 96 AD. Okay, so the historical seals that we're talking about here are going to be very different from what we then refer to as the three prophetic seals, which are those that would be after Christ's birth. And so you've got the four historical, that leaves three because there's 7 total. Oh, they're in the future. Let's call them prophetic seals. So very simple, nothing magical about how we come up with these particular names. Now, the symbolism associated with the 4 historical seal are the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse that you've seen in movies and, various places and things like that. So that's the imagery that John uses to describe the events occurring in the first 4,000 years of the Earth's temporal existence. Now, these are very, very different from the images that he uses and the symbolism used for the last three prophetic seals. Now, keep in mind, the reason why do we have seven seals? It's just like always. The seven is a symbolic number. Now, these are actual periods of time, but the seven is highly symbolic. It has the expression of fullness or completeness. Now, notice we have the division between historical seals, of which there are four, and then we have three prophetic seals. So you get this breakdown of 4 by 3 to arrive at the total of 7. So this is also discussed in more detail. If you go back to my podcast from Come Follow Me number 5 in October 29, 2023, I did that, where I described the numerology, and you can get this, how words are used to define numbers and so on and so forth. Okay, so as we're talking here about these first four seal, we get the first four that are introduced by the four beasts from Revelation 4 and 5, in which they're basically saying, come and see. And some would say, and I'll talk about it in a moment, some of the versions of the Greek manuscripts only say the word come. They don't say come and see. But at any rate, we have these four beasts that we learned about from Revelation chapter 4 and 5, and the first of them says come and see, or just come. And so John then sees the opening of the seal, and then that happens 4 times. Now, what's interesting about this is that there is a particular pattern that is being used. And so the order and the symmetry that exists within the book of Revelation is sometimes rather amazing to me. But we're going to see this 4 by 3 grouping in other ways. So we're going to see it with the 7 seals, as I've mentioned. We're going to see it in the case of the 7 trumpet plagues that begin in chapter 8 of the book of Revelation, where they're going to see the first 4 trumpets are aligned together, similar attributes, similar kind of symbolism occurring. Then you're going to get the last 3, very different. Same thing with the 7 vial plagues. You have 4 and 3. And so these kinds of things are occurring with some consistency. And some refer to the first 4 plagues, the first 4 seals, the first vial plagues, as kind of the creational or the earthly seals. And then the last 3 would be the divine seals, all right, which is fine. There is some merit to that type of breakdown, if you will. Okay, so now keep in mind also that when John was having his vision on Patmos in 96 AD, this is basically early in the period of the 5th seal. And John was then told in Revelation 4:1, when his visions really began, that he was going to see things which must be hereafter. And so what the focus, that tells us, the focus is essentially not on these historical seals. Yes, they're there. They're going to give us some context for understanding a lot about what still lies in the future, but he does so only very briefly, because the focus is going to be on things which must be hereafter. So in these first 4 seals that take us for 4,000 years, from 4,000 BC to roughly 1 AD, it's going to be really, really fast, right? And Robert Millett kind of talked about this when he said, quote, "To put this in perspective, only 11 verses are used to discuss the events of the first 5 seals, meaning the period of time from the creation to 1000 AD. This is approximately 3% of the total number of verses in Revelation. On the other hand, 281 verses, or about 70%, deal with the 6th and 7th seals, the time from 1000 AD to the end of the millennium." Close quote. Now, I've kind of broken this down a little bit more so that we can be more precise about exactly what's happening. And so we're putting up an image now that describes the number of verses that are used to describe each of the seals. So if you look at Revelation 6, the first 2 verses are the first seal. That's what we're going to be talking about in my next podcast that I do after I kind of give you this overview. So 4,000 to 3,000, we get two verses. Then in the next two verses, in verses 3 and 4, we get the second seal. Again, it's two verses. In the next two verses, verses 5 and 6, that covers the third seal. Then finally, in verses 7 and 8 of Revelation 6, you've got the fourth seal, again, two verses. So we just covered in 8 verses in the book of Revelation, we just covered 4,000 years. That's why this is not a history book. And it's not something that is focused on things in the past. It talks about things which shall be hereafter. Okay, now things start to expand a little bit. As you get to the fifth seal, you can see here in Revelation 6, verses 9 through 11. So now the fifth seal, oh wow, we got a big one extra verse to cover the fifth seal from 1 AD to approximately 1000 AD. Then by the time we get to the sixth seal, notice this, 23 verses from Revelation 6:12 through chapter 7, verse 17. That's essentially a good portion of Revelation 6 and all of chapter 7 constitute the sixth seal. It's a total of 23 verses, and it covers from the period of 1000 to 2000 plus AD. Now, there's a reason why I put the word plus there, and the reason isn't just because, hey, we're already past the year 2000, so we got to add a plus sign because things aren't really jiving that well. Here we are in 2024, so we're beyond the time. The plus actually exists. It is true, we are beyond the year 2000. I can't deny that. But the book of Revelation actually explains that the sixth seal is going to be extended for some period. It's not specific. It doesn't say specifically, but when we get to chapter 7, talking about what is events occurring in the sixth seal, we're going to find out that we have some things that we got to get done during this sixth seal, and among them is all the temple work that needs to be done in this sixth seal to prepare for the second coming. And so we're going to have a description in the book of Revelation itself that tells us, hold the phone, hang on, we got some work to do, and we'll talk about that when we get to chapter 7. And finally, after you get through 23 verses of the sixth seal, you finally have the seventh seal being opened in Revelation 8, verse 1, that then continues through the end of the book of Revelation for a total of 370 verses. Now, a lot of times the seventh seal gets equated with the millennium, but the reality of it is in the book of Revelation, John barely even talks about the millennium. He gives it a whopping 3 verses. The rest of it is all talking about the resurrection, about the little season after the resurrection, and the millennium, the celestialization of the earth, and the huge chunk of time between Revelation 8:1 and the start of the millennium in chapter 20. That's 12 chapters, by the way, including what I call the 12 to 14 flashback chapters. The huge bulk of it is all going to be about the second coming and events leading up very close to the time frame of the second coming. So that gives you kind of a breakdown of how these seals, and this also kind of, I think, helps explain how, if you don't understand what these seals represent and the symbolism associated with the seals, you can never understand the book of Revelation. It's a non-starter. You have to have this foundational information. And the first 4 seals, again, are primarily to give historical context and structure to help us then understand the 5th, 6th, and 7th seals. Okay, so again, continuing our overview, I'm going to give you briefly a discussion about what each of the seals represents, just as kind of a lead-in to what we'll be talking about in more detail in the podcasts that follow. So the first 4 seals include the symbolic images of the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, as I've mentioned. These are the colored horses that you'll find in the Old Testament history, and they foreshadow and mirror apocalyptic images and events just before Christ's second coming. And the mirror images are in reverse order. And I talked a little bit about this when I was talking about the structure of the book of Revelation in Come Follow Me podcast number 4, which I did on October 22nd of 2023. So if you want to get even more context, more broadly than these seals that I'm talking about today, go back and check out the structure of the book of Revelation. I go kind of chapter by chapter and break it down into sections where I talk about how the book of Revelation is structured, but a lot of it is based on these the opening of the 7 seals. So you'll get more detail there. So let's talk briefly about each of the first 4 historical seals. The first seal, we're going to see Enoch's white horse of triumph in the years from 4000 to 3000 BC. And this is a type for Christ's white horse of triumph that we will find introduced to us during the third woe of the 7th seal in Revelation chapters 15 through 19. And so when you get down finally to Revelation 19:11, which is the actual second coming itself, it says, quote, "And I saw heaven opened, and behold, a white horse, and he that sat upon him was called Faithful and True, and in righteousness he doth judge and make war." Close quote. So that's a description of the second coming here in Revelation 19. It involves Christ sitting on a white horse, and lo and behold, hey, we're right back where we started, because Enoch rode a white horse. So you have white on the 2 bookends that we're talking about here, and they're going to work backwards. So we're going to get a white horse, then we're going to get a red horse, and as we work back from Christ's white horse at the second coming, we're going to get the red-colored blood of Armageddon. Before that, we're going to get a black horse, and then we have the blackness of spiritual darkness on the earth. We have a pale horse representing spiritual sickness, and you work your way back from the second coming. Oh, we have a lot of spiritual sickness, paleness in the lives of the world leading up to the second coming. So they reverse the order. So it's really marvelous symbolism, and the parallels and the imagery is pretty fantastic, really, when you stop and think about it. If you look at these things carefully, I mean, there isn't a piece of literature that can hold a candle to the book of Revelation, in my humble opinion. All right, so the first seal is, again, going to be Enoch. A lot of people are going to mess this up and think, I see this guy on the white horse in the first seal. Well, I see that same horse and a guy on the horse in Revelation 19. Must be the same guy. But we just kind of ignore the 6,000 years of difference between them. But they're 2 different things, but one is a type and a foreshadow. So even as Enoch triumphed and succeeded against evil in his day, so it shall be in the time of Christ. Now the second seal deals with the red horse of destruction during the period from 3000 to 2000 BC. This, of course, is going to be the period of time when we have the flood of Noah, and just there's lots of warfare, so truly a lot of bloodshed, but also the destruction of everybody on the entire earth, with the exception of the 8 people that were allowed to survive on the ark. And again, as I mentioned, this is also kind of a destruction, a type for the destruction of wicked during the second woe, which we call Armageddon in Revelation chapter 9, and continuing from verse 13 all the way through chapter 11, verse 14. Now, this period of time is described in the book of Moses in chapter 7, verses 60 and 61, where it says, quote, "And the Lord said unto Enoch, As I live, even so will I come in the last days, in the days of wickedness and vengeance, to fulfill the oath which I have made unto you concerning the children of Noah." Notice how they're tying Noah always to the second coming. And then it says, "And the day shall come that the earth shall rest, but before that day the heavens shall be darkened, and a veil of darkness shall cover the earth, and the heavens shall shake, and also the earth, and great tribulation shall be among the children of men. But my people will I preserve." Close quote. Again, that's a pretty good description, of course, of what's going on in the time of Noah, but it's clearly showing how those days are a type for the conditions that will exist in the last days, particularly during the time of the war that we call Armageddon. Okay, then we come to the third seal, which is the black horse that represents physical famine during the years from 2000 to 1000 BC. And so this is also going to then be a type for the blackness of spiritual famine that will exist during the first woe of Revelation, found in chapter 9, verses 1 through 12. And so I know I'm not giving you much detail on these woes. They become a very, very important part of this. If you go back and listen to my podcast on the structure, I go into the first woe, second woe, and third woe in more detail. But the third woe is essentially the second coming with Christ and his white horse. One back from that, the second woe, you have Armageddon, the red of bloodshed that corresponds to the second seal, is in terms of typology. And now we back up one more where we come to the first woe, and this is a type of spiritual darkness which is described in Revelation chapter 9, verses 1 through 3, where it says, quote, "And the fifth angel sounded," that means the sounding of the first woe, "and I saw a star fall from heaven unto the earth, and to him was given the key of the bottomless pit. And he opened the bottomless pit, and there arose a smoke out of the pit, as the smoke of a great furnace. And the sun and the air were darkened by reason of the smoke of the pit. And there came out of the smoke locusts upon the earth." Close quote. So this darkness that we see prevailing during the first woe is a kind of a blackness, a spiritual blackness. It's a spiritual famine that then coincides typologically with the physical famine that existed during the years 2000 to 1000 BC. And this was the great period where you have people like Abraham leaving the Ur of Chaldees because of the famine that existed in that area. And he went up to Hebron and then down to Canaan, where lo and behold, we got another famine. And so we've got to then go to Egypt, where this comes along with the story of Joseph and the 7 years of fat, the 7 years of lean, and the famine, and how all the children of Israel end up in Egypt because of the famine that existed in Canaan. And so it was a great time where you had a lot of movement on the face of the earth by peoples who were basically starving to death. And that's the black horse of physical famine that we'll talk about in more detail. Okay, you come then to the fourth seal, which is a pale horse representing spiritual sickness. And this covers the period from about 1000 BC until 1 AD. And so this is the time where essentially, if you go to 975 BC, is the time when the rule of Solomon ends, and the United Kingdom of Israel basically comes to an end, because as soon as Solomon died, you had a civil war that erupts between the northern tribes and the tribes in the south, known as Judah, or the Jews, as they came to be known. You have this civil war, and so they kind of split apart. And it was a time of great spiritual sickness. You've got a certain number of kings in the north. Every one of them was a wicked king. They never had a righteous king in the northern tribes. And in the south, you get a few of them, kind of like the Hezekiahs, but there were a lot more wicked kings. And so it's just a whole time, all the way up until the time of Christ. And of course, you had Malachi, who lived as the last prophet of the Old Testament, and he's gone by 400 BC. So you have this period from 400 BC to 1 AD. We didn't even have any prophets. It's just all spiritual sickness that is described by this pale horse in the book of Revelation. It's also this type of this overflowing scourge or desolating spiritual sickness. And that's what we find also in these last days. Again, working our way back. Oh, we're in the era of the sick pale horse in our own time. Bruce R. McConkie described it this way. He said, quote, "Indeed, one of the final great signs of the times, an event just preceding the second coming, is that an outflowing scourge, or an overflowing scourge, a desolating sickness shall cover the land." Close quote. He's not talking about 1000 BC to 180. He's talking about our time frame, the period in which we live, which as we get closer and closer, we're going to see this desolating sickness, spiritual sickness, that is going to cover the land. And I see no reason why not to include also this thought that you have these physical sicknesses that also occur, but certainly a spiritual sickness that is going to desolate the earth as we approach the second coming. Okay, so that's the first four seals. We have the fifth seal that covers the time period in which Jesus Christ was alive and had his mortal ministry. We currently live in the sixth seal, which covers the period from about 1000 to 2000 AD plus, as I mentioned before. And Joseph Fielding Smith said this, quote, "We have evidence beyond dispute that Adam was driven out of the Garden of Eden about 6,000 years ago, or perhaps a short time less. It is possible for us, by using the Bible chronology and that given by the Lord in the Book of Mormon and Doctrine and Covenants, to figure this almost accurately," close quote. So, as I mentioned before, we can't specifically say that the sixth seal ends at the year 2000. I sometimes get asked, so are we in the sixth seal or seventh seal? I said, we're still in the sixth seal. And there's a reason for that, which I'll now explain in a little bit more detail. So if you look in Revelation chapter 6, verses 12 through 17, describe the sixth seal, including this great earthquake that's going to occur at the end of the sixth seal. Okay, and so that you then come down to verse 17, and after this description of this earthquake and other physical calamities, the question is asked, who shall be able to stand? Revelation 7 is going to answer that question. Okay, in other words, as we work our way through the sixth seal, we get to the point of this great earthquake. Who's going to be able to endure it, spiritually speaking, primarily? Who's going to be able to stand? As I mentioned, Revelation 7 will answer the question. When we get through the end of Revelation 7, then boom, the seventh seal opens in verse 1 of Revelation 8. Now, as to the timing, this is what we're told in verses 1 through 3 of Revelation 7. And again, that last verse asks the question, who shall be able to stand? And that's in chapter 6. Now here's where the answer comes in Revelation 7, verses 1 through 3. Quote, "And after these things," in other words, after the great earthquake, as the end of the sixth seal is supposed to occur, John says, "I saw four angels standing on the four corners of the earth, holding the four winds of the earth, that the wind should not blow on the earth, nor on the sea, nor on any tree. And I saw another angel ascending from the east, having the seal of the living God, and he cried with a loud voice to the four angels," in other words, these destroying angels, "to whom it was given to hurt the earth and the sea, saying, Hurt not the earth, neither the sea, nor the trees, till we have sealed the servants of our God in their foreheads." Close quote. Now, we have a lot of explaining to do when we get to Revelation 7 of what all this means, but the essence of it is here, telling us that that sixth seal is going to come to an end only after we have finished the work of sealing the servants of God in our forehead, preparatory of the second coming. All right, so John recognizes in the book of Revelation itself that yes, we have these six seals. They're each 1,000 years, and then we get up to the year 2000 when theoretically we should be closing the sixth seal and opening the seventh, but lo and behold, we have this angel ascending from the east saying to these four destroying angels, "Hold your horses." Now, I don't mean the apocalyptic horses, right? Those guys they're past history, right? We're just hold your horses because we've got some work to do before the destruction occurs in connection with the seventh seal. And there is a lot of destruction, okay? What you're seeing at the end of the sixth seal with this great earthquake is just a foreshadow of what's going to come. And in fact, we refer to earthquakes how you have these foreshocks that kind of signal, hey, there's something big that's going to happen. Well, that big earthquake that happens at the end of the sixth seal that's described in Revelation 6 is basically just a foreshock of the earthquakes that will then fall and will occur during the seventh seal. Okay, so the bottom line is we get the seventh seal delayed pending the sealing of the servants of God in our forehead. In other words, it's temple work. We got some temple work to get done, both for the living and for the dead, that we'll talk about in more detail as we come along. Okay, so finally, after we get to the seventh seal that begins in Revelation chapter 8, keeping in mind that's the seal that gets covered in over 300 verses. It's going to take 300 verses to describe the seventh seal. We call it the millennium, but it covers a whole lot more, and the millennium is just one small fraction of what those 300 verses are going to describe. Most of the time is spent, of course, dealing with the events leading up to the millennium, including the second coming. That basically encompasses Revelation 8 through the first 3 verses in Revelation 20. Then in Revelation 20, verses 4 through 15, you get the millennium, you get the little season, you get the final judgment, you get the death of the earth, and then boom, Revelation 21, we've got the celestialization of the earth, and then moving on to the last chapter in Revelation 22 is essentially the epilogue to the book of Revelation, which we'll kind of do summaries of these various events at another time that kind of gives you an overview. Again, we're trying to just make sure we understand the forest before we start looking at these individual trees. So next week I'll start with a detailed description of the first seal. You thought you got a lot today. There's a lot more. So hold on, fasten your seatbelts. We'll be talking about the first seal in our next podcast. And as I mentioned, it's going to be a whopping 2 verses, Revelation 6, 1 through 2. If you ever need to, kind of get your feet underneath you and have a foundation for these seals as we go through them, you can always come back to this podcast and get this overview to make sure you keep track of things and how they kind of operate together. So thank you all for listening, watching, subscribing, sharing, and the things you do, and to Jennifer, her technical help, and I will see you next time for the first seal.